Welcome to the Scrum.org Community Podcast, a podcast from the home of Scrum. In this podcast, we feature professional Scrum trainers and other Scrum practitioners sharing their stories and experiences to help learn from the experience of others. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to the Scrum.org Community Podcast. I'm your host, Dave West, CEO here at Scrum.org in a sunny Boston, Massachusetts. Today's podcast is actually going to be focused on a topic that I'm not actually very good at, and I'm very grateful that we have this opportunity to talk about it, facilitation. As you can tell from my podcast, if you've listened to any of this series, I do like to talk, maybe too much. So facilitation, it's a key stance of an Agile practitioner. So we know a lot about that. So today, I'm very fortunate that I've got an expert in that field, on that subject, Douglas Ferguson, founder of Voltage Control. Welcome to the podcast, Douglas.
Dave, it's so great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about facilitation, which is one of my favorite things to talk about.
I know. And actually, for our listeners, I met Douglas. We were somehow got introduced, and we had a long, much longer than we'd planned, conversation about facilitation and its role in Agile and its role in Scrum. So that's the reason why I asked Douglas if he had something to do one afternoon, and here he is talking to us today. So as we begin this podcast, I think it's important for our audience to have a little idea of who you are and how you got to be really into facilitation. So who are you and where did you come from, Douglas?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I don't share in common with a lot of my facilitation peers. And I think the Scrum community might find it interesting because I was a CTO prior to founding Voltage Control. Started off writing code in high school even, and out of college wrote code for startups and started leading engineering teams and eventually product teams and designers as a CTO. And through that process, became really curious about what made for highly collaborative teams, and was always consuming new types of tools such as, extreme programming and Agile and Scrum and all these different things, and even design methodologies like design thinking and design sprints, and always just trying these things out and seeing what works. And that's what led me into realizing that there might be a place for me in the world of facilitation and how I can bring this to people who haven't experienced it before. Because a lot of times people that call themselves facilitators, they're a certain type of person who wants to go out and lead these things all the time. But in the workplace, there's lots of folks that really need to show up as facilitators. And in fact, that's evident by the fact that we all talk about how horrible our meetings are. And, in my book, Magical Meetings, I say there's no such thing as a bad meeting, just bad facilitators.
No, so it's a bit like pets, right? There's no such thing as a bad pet. It's only bad owners. That's something we should all take to heart. So Voltage Control is an interesting name for an organization. The one electrical engineering class I did at university, which was awful, by the way, just for reference, and I was awful at it. Maybe that's another pet analogy. Maybe actually there's no such thing as bad classes. It's just bad students, right? Anyway, my understanding is voltage control is used to manipulate analog circuits. So that's an interesting choice from the name of the organization, Douglas.
Yeah, I am a musician. Was playing music when I was in high school and writing code too. And I have a large synthesizer, and it's a modular synthesizer, and the synthesizer is comprised of voltage controlled modules. So the patch cables carry controlled voltage, and that's how they operate and to carry signal. And I've often used it as a metaphor when I think about teams and organizations, because once you start rearranging things and moving things in the synthesizer, like unplugging cables or plugging them into different spots, it can change the sound drastically, often to detrimental impacts, right? And so if you just walk up to that thing and go, well, this seems like it would be more efficient over here, or this might make more sense over here, without understanding the nuance of why it was put together in the way it was, or even the nuance of how these modules work, i.e. the people. How do the people work, and how are the people connected? And if we aren't paying attention to those things, then we can cause detrimental harm to the harmony or the sound of the piece we're creating or the environment we're in. And as I was thinking about how I wanted to name the company something that was personal and meaningful for me, I reflected on that metaphor. And the thing that really drove it home for me was as I thought about how the definition of voltage is potential energy. And I thought about we're manipulating the potential. We're helping people harness their potential in their organizations. That really spoke to me.
Wow. But the word control is an interesting one because and particularly with your heavy emphasis on facilitation and the work you've done there, and the book you wrote, which is an awesome book. I recommend it. The control, as a facilitator, from my understanding, aren't I meant to be unbiased? Aren't I not meant to control anything, but just, I'm like this, I don't know, wind reed, I don't know, some sort of, hippie kind of analogy. I don't know, but control sounds a little bit scary.
Yeah, it's like the water, right? That's just kind of flowing around things, or the Gumby on the side of the street that's just waving around. I don't think you can get things done. If you can't be a servant leader without having some leadership, right? Without kind of driving stuff in a direction. And as a facilitator or using facilitation skills, we have to understand what outcome we're trying to drive toward, and we can steer the group there. The point is, we shouldn't be mandating or telling people, do this, go in this direction, make these specific moves. It starts to get into micromanagement, right? And so a great way to combat micromanagement, if that's something you tend to, or if you want to move further in the direction away from micromanagement, facilitation is a great way to do that, but still move toward a common goal, still help the group understand together where we might need to go, or a nuanced variety of that direction, how we might steer it in a subtle new way.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Understand the difference between control and direction, and sort of like micromanagement versus that sort of direction stuff. I think it's a really interesting nuance because I've been facilitated to heck at times where I felt the exact opposite. I felt that I'm literally being forced to do this almost uncomfortable series of yoga stances, and my body is going, I don't want to do this. This is not fun. But the facilitator was so into it that I just felt that I couldn't say no.
Yeah, it's so important as a facilitator to read the room and notice what's happening. And there's a really important quality in a facilitator, which is often doesn't come natural at first, because when folks start facilitating, they typically will hold on to their methods really tightly, or they'll have a plan and they want to work the plan, because it's perfect and they figured it all out. And it's really, they get kind of frightened in the moment because they see this big group they're responsible for, these outcomes are responsible, and they push this plan through. And to your example, you're in these yoga poses that feel uncomfortable. And can you imagine looking across the room and seeing these people? Wow, they don't look like they're enjoying themselves, right? And I think that's, rather than getting frightened and doubling down on the plan and just going, I got to sweat through this. And, it's not comfortable for the facilitator, I can tell you. Like, it's not an enjoyable place to be. But it's frightening to steer outside of that because they typically get in the zone of, I got to get through this and make the plan work. And it's so much more powerful to let go, to be nimble, to be agile, right? Like, and in fact, we tell people to practice making 3 versions of your agenda. Make one, throw it away, make another one, throw it away, make another one. And then, no matter what you run into, you at least got 3 ways to do it. And you've built up a muscle and an ability to rethink different varieties of how to approach it.
It's really, really interesting. So I really like the point around having that flexibility to use facilitation techniques as the audience allows you to, and in the situation merits itself. So as an Agile practitioner, I guess the first question is, why do I care? I mean, facilitation, we're not trying to mediate peace. We're not running most Agile practitioners aren't working at the UN, though interestingly, a lot of Scrum was practiced in the UN in the 90s by Ken Schwaber. But so we're not in these high stress situations. It's just the Scrum team and a few stakeholders, and we're trying to get to something. So why do I need any of this crazy facilitation talk, Douglas?
Well, you say it's not high stress, but often the workplace can be quite stressful when emotions flare up, and we can get passionate and dedicated to our work, and believe that we should do it this way, and someone believes that we should do it some other way, and so decisions can be hard often, and so moving into situations where we can come together and make decisions more effectively, more calmly, and delineate between when we're actually disagreeing and when we aren't. And there's situations where the group's in violent agreement, but no one's stepping up to point it out, right? And so actually designating a role, and this is where the unbiased piece comes in. It can be really powerful to have a facilitator outside of the main group that's doing the work, especially if you've got two groups that are coming together to collaborate on something. Like if you have someone facilitating from one of those groups, then there's kind of a sense of power that they have over this collaboration. And so finding a third party, it can be a really great way to kind of level the playing field. And it's not really about bringing in an outsider necessarily. It could just be someone from a third team. And I see a lot of companies do that, where people will borrow someone for a few hours just to help with a session, show up and do a thing. And that can be a great way as well to cross-pollinate ideas throughout the organization, because even though it's not your project that you have stuff that you're responsible for, but it might impact something that you have coming down the road, or just understanding what's happening in this other group that's working on a different module. It's helpful to have context on those things sometimes. And so it comes down to decision making, it comes down to understanding options, a lot of the principles that, when you really look at the Agile Manifesto, a lot of the things around, the tenets that they believe in around, whether it's
people and teams, for instance, rather than process.
Exactly. And so if we're going to prioritize these things, facilitation can help us get there, right? And we can use facilitation to lean into those values that we have, because we can invite people to the conversation better. We can also start to understand these things that might be causing issues down the road, for instance, because if we don't have those conversations earlier, then they can rear their heads later. Oftentimes I see people just kind of going through the motions and sweeping stuff under the rug until it really bites us down the road. And I think when people are practicing Agile and they're testing things out and seeing stuff, we're shipping code, and seeing stuff in real life, then there's this interest in learning. And so why don't we apply that same interest into our relationships at work and the projects that are unfolding versus just the software itself?
I think I think those points are spot on. I think obviously Scrum, we care very much about that cycle of learning. That's what the sprints are, and the feedback of sprint review and retrospective. But so let me just make sure that I'm getting this right though, Douglas. So you're saying that everybody should have some level of facilitation skill and a desire to use it. It isn't just the anointed Scrum Master, Agile coach, external consultant that comes in. Is that true? Is that the message that you're sending here?
Well, I haven't specifically brought that up yet, but it's an important point. The thing is that there are certainly people that will facilitate more often. I would say anyone who calls a meeting to order should be thinking more deeply about just basic facilitation skills. And it's really unfortunate that it's not taught in leadership programs or even in undergrad. And it's kind of a mystery to me, because Well, frankly, there's a lot of stuff that's not taught, right? Like oftentimes you get into the
Yes.
workplace, right? And it's like no one's ever told you how to use a calendar. And so you got to learn all this etiquette of how to show up and be an actual worker, right? And some of that stuff is probably learned nowadays just through osmosis and internships and things, but no one really takes the time to say how to be a great meeting participant, how to actually run a great meeting, because learning facilitation skills can help you have more appreciation for those that are running the meeting. So you become a better meeting participant. You can actually assist without usurping control. You can assist them in really meaningful ways if you kind of understand the dynamics and what they're going through.
So everybody needs to bring some of these skills to bear, either in terms of understanding them so you help whoever is facilitating that meeting. And also, are you saying, Douglas, that that all meetings need to be actively facilitated, or is there some sort of bar? When there's 3 people, or when it's a Wednesday afternoon, you should always facilitate, or are there some bars, or should every meeting be facilitated?
I think every meeting is facilitated at some level. The
Hmm.
question is, how much intention do we take to it? How important is it? What's the quality and the purpose of the meeting that might warrant the experience that we need to design into that meeting, right? And so we may not be bringing like really heavyweight tools into our short 2-person meeting, but the more you facilitate and the more you start to adapt tools and techniques, the more that they will just find their way into everything you're doing, because you just become better at hosting people and bringing them together to do things. And so, for instance, one really powerful technique is to have people split people into smaller groups. And that's not something you have to be super planful about. But if you're hosting a meeting of 6 people, you might realize I'm just going to put them in pairs really quick. That might actually help things move faster in this moment. I didn't know I was going to need to do that yesterday, but in this moment, I'm realizing it. That's the kind of stuff that starts to happen the more you practice it, the more you lean into learning the skills. And but to your point, there's certain meetings and gatherings that we do need to be really planful about, and the more we are planful about any of those opportunities, then we start to learn those moves, and they just kind of show up all the time. So specifically, things we might want to be more planful about, things that are higher stakes, things that have repetitive patterns to them, where we can start to put in, there's a reason why these ritualistic meetings in the Scrum world have patterns to them, or kind of ways of doing them, because we do them a lot, and let's make them efficient, and let's have a way of doing them, right? And so when you think about retrospective, for example, that's a way to facilitate a retrospective, but that's also a great way to mix things up, because people can get bored with this kind of repetition. So think about, if I was going to be planful about something, retrospective could be a really fun way to say, okay, how might I show up with a Miro or a mural board and really just make this feel way different than we have done in the past? Or what kind of metaphor might I bring to get people thinking a little bit differently? Do I bring in start, stop, continue, or some other kind of framework what, so what, now what? There's so many different ways to do a retrospective, and so mixing it up is a great way to try different tools and techniques without it feeling, I don't know, forced.
So obviously, every meeting, particularly maybe every meeting, but certainly the important ones, there's usually an outcome and a context to that, whether it's gaining consensus, resolving conflict, brainstorming ideas, creating, doing some sort of creative work or consolidation work, these kind of things, or review and feedback or whatever. So does bearing the intent in mind, does that influence you to pick a particular set of techniques?
Absolutely. So we have an approach that we call workshop design, and there's a free workshop design template on the website, and we do a workshop design workshop every now and then. We don't currently have one available, but the template's fairly straightforward to use, and the concept is applying learning experience design to the workshop or meeting process. And
Yeah.
and I think even if you don't sit down and use the template, some of these patterns of this approach is really powerful. So I think it's worth breaking down. So essentially, in learning experience design, there's a concept called backwards design. And with the workshop design template, we start with that end objective in mind. So how are the learners leaving the experience? And some of you may have raised your eyebrow, like, learner, what do you mean learner? We have this belief that all meetings are learning experiences. And if we set people up to be in learning mindsets and apply learning design principles, we're going to design better experiences, because then they're going to be more open to hearing what the coworker has to say and being more receptive to the ideas of other people, because we put people in a learning mindset. And so thinking of reframing meeting participants as learners is kind of a powerful way to invite those kinds of design tools in. So thinking about the way the learner is leaving, how do we want them to leave transformed or different in some way? And then thinking about how they're entering, and then looking at that gap. And that gap can help us understand, okay, well, if we know they're entering in a certain way and we want them to leave in a different way, then how might we design that differently? And of course, we might have different ways people are entering. Like an executive might be entering that space differently than a frontline contributor. And so we can, if they're flying at different altitudes, one's thinking strategically and another's thinking tactically, we might want to be mindful of that as we kind of design the session. And then we're looking at, so that kind of gets to your point around the purpose, right? Because that outcome that we're kind of, how we're wanting them to leave is directly impacted by what we are trying to accomplish. And that'll really influence how you think about opening the session, all the work you might do in the middle, and then how you close. And often I'll see, real rookie mistake of facilitators or anyone starting to hear about some of the stuff, just glom on the icebreakers or activities and not thinking about that purpose. And that's why people get a distaste for icebreakers, or people telling them to do strange yoga moves or whatever. Like, what's your favorite ice cream? It's like, why are we talking about ice cream? Aren't we here to figure out this weird bug that's going on? It's like, if you really want to create some connection before you get into the content, it's going to be way more powerful if the connection that you're inviting is somehow aligned with the content you're going to go into or the work you're going to do together. And so being mindful of that and planful about that will really get people way more engaged and way more attuned to what you're asking them to do.
Wow, mind blown. You said two things. You probably said more than that, but my mind was so blown on the first two. One, thinking about every meeting as a learning situation, it reminds me of my grandmother used to say to me, "You've got two ears and one mouth. Use them in that order." And I'm like, "Oh, thanks, Gran." I never did, but she was a very wise lady, Lillian Carter. And the second thing I never thought to do was think about how people turn up. Obviously, you do that when you're in a very tricky sales situation or a very tricky, maybe you're going for a divorce or something, and you think a lot about, oh my God, is Bob going to come with this? But in most meetings, even some pretty high risk ones, I've never thought about that. And where do we want everybody to get to at the end? And then looking at that distance, and the fact that people come with different things might mean that we structure the meeting into two segments. It might mean, wow, that's really good stuff, Douglas. I think I've learned something. I mean, whether I apply it is a whole different thing, but I really have learned something. That's awesome.
The decision making is a great example of this, Dave. It's how many times have you seen groups become disgruntled about a leader making a decision? And oftentimes it's because the expectation wasn't set at the beginning.
Yeah.
We didn't consider that they were coming in thinking that we were going to make this decision together. And all the leader needed to do was say, I'm going to collect your input, but ultimately I'm going to make this decision. They would have been totally happy with that. But since their expectation was different, they went through all these motions in this meeting or session, and then were, bummed to find out that, wait, they had this feeling like, well, why'd you ask me if you weren't going to take my advice? And so it's so powerful to front load that expectation setting, or even, a classic opener we're big fans of is asking, why are we here? What are we trying to do? Because it's really important as a facilitator to clarify the purpose, but it's really powerful to also test it. Because if we've shared it, told them, make sure to name the meeting based on the purpose. So it's really, we've done everything we can to clarify it, but then let's double check. Let's trust but verify that the purpose is aligned. Because if it isn't, we can correct that out of the gate. And maybe our participants can correct it for us. Like, let's say that everyone's aligned but one person. Next thing you know, the whole group is helping address that error, and you don't even have to do anything. And we call that the lazy facilitator. You know, if we can set up conditions where the group does the work and we can just kind of lean back, then you've really hit that Zen moment.
Wow, I'm feeling that I've got to write some post-it notes and stick them around my screen, so the next meeting I'm much more I show up with a lot more intention, which is what you're advocating, and I think that's fantastic. And I could talk to you all day, Douglas, and I'm sure I would learn lots from you about facilitation. But I'm afraid we are coming to the end of our time together. This has been really, really interesting. As I said, mind blown. I love that learner stance, and I love the thinking about how people attend. And then, obviously, using the right patterns or having a series of patterns that we can use to bridge that gap between what we're trying to get people from to where we're trying to get them to. Super, super interesting. So thank you for blowing my mind today. Before we go, I know our listeners would love to hear where they can find out more from you.
Absolutely. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so feel free to follow me there or come check out any of the content. Also on voltagecontrol.com, you can check out our Facilitation Academy, where we offer certification and courses, and would love to check you out. There's a lot of free content, so feel free to jump in and start learning with us.
That's awesome. So thank you, Douglas. Thank you for your time today. So today, for our listeners, I was with Douglas Ferguson, founder of Voltage Control, and we were talking about that interesting and often thorny topic of facilitation. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Douglas, and thank you, listeners. This is Dave West here at the Scrum.org Community Podcast. Hopefully, you have enjoyed today, and if you have, maybe you want to listen to more. There's lots on the site. Please go. Some interesting topics ranging from professional Scrum trainers talking about their journeys to, obviously today we talked about facilitation. Agile marketing was another recent topic. There's lots on there, so feel free to consume that content. And thank you for attending. Bye, everybody.